He quietly took his seat in first class, polite, calm, and carrying a uniform bag. But the flight attendant shouts at him, paused, and asked a question she would soon regret. "Are you sure you belong here?" What she didn't know. His wife owns the entire airline, and she was already on her way. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this kind of story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. He sat quietly in his first-class seat near the window, his hands resting gently on his lap. The soft sound of the engines hummed through the cabin while golden light from the late afternoon sun poured in through the glass. His name was Azim. He wasn't wearing his uniform, just a simple white shirt tucked into dark gray pants and a light jacket draped over his shoulders. Above him, in the overhead bin, hung his garment bag. On the outside, stitched in bold blue letters, it read, "Police Chief, Chicago Metro." But Azim wasn't the kind of man who needed people to know who he was. He didn't demand attention. He didn't carry pride in his voice. He carried it in how he walked, how he listened, and how he stayed calm when others didn't. This was a big trip. He had been invited to speak at a national leadership summit for law enforcement. It was the kind of recognition that didn't come easily, something earned after 30 years of service. His wife, Zareen, had texted him right before takeoff. "Call me when you land. So proud of you. I love you." That one line brought a small smile to his face. She always reminded him of what mattered, even when the world tried to forget it. As other passengers boarded, Azim stayed quiet. He didn't scroll through his phone. He didn't read a book. He simply sat with his thoughts, relaxed and steady. But then a voice cut through the stillness. "Excuse me, sir," a woman said. Her voice was polite but cold underneath. It was the flight attendant. Her name tag read Eliza. She stood tall, with perfect posture, red lipstick that didn't move, and a stare that seemed to look through people rather than at them. "Are you sure you're supposed to be in this seat?" Azim turned toward her, meeting her gaze with calm eyes. "Yes, 1C, that's my seat." Eliza didn't move. She glanced at the ticket still resting on his armrest tray, then looked back at him, her eyes slightly narrowed. "This is a first-class seat," she repeated, this time just loud enough for the row behind him to hear. "I know," Azim said simply. "That's what I purchased." Her smile shrank a little. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Without a word, Azim reached into his coat and handed it to her. She studied it for longer than necessary, her fingers pressed against the edges as if expecting to find something wrong. But the pass was clear. Seat 1C, first class, paid in full. Eliza handed it back, but her tone didn't soften. "Are you traveling on duty? Or accompanying someone? This seat is for full-fare passengers only." Azim nodded slowly. "I'm not escorting anyone. I'm flying alone." She blinked, clearly unsure what to say next. Then she gave a short nod and walked off toward the galley without another word. Azim leaned back in his seat again. Outside, the luggage cart rolled by. Inside, he could feel the shift in energy. A man across the aisle looked at him, then quickly turned away. A woman in the next row whispered something to her husband, who responded without making eye contact. From behind him, a soft voice whispered, "Why'd she only ask him?" He picked up his phone again and typed, "Already being questioned." "Same story. Don't worry, I'm fine." Then he sent the message to Zareen and set the phone back down. He wasn't fine. Not really. But he had learned how to carry that feeling without letting it show. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this flight wasn't going to be ordinary. And for Eliza, it was about to be the most unforgettable flight of her life. Eliza returned to the galley, gripping the edge of the counter a little tighter than usual. Her face stayed calm, but inside, her thoughts raced. She had worked this route for years, and she knew how things were supposed to go. First class was for a certain kind of passenger. The quiet ones in suits, the women with designer bags, the men with gold watches and soft voices. But Azim? Something about him felt out of place to her. Maybe it was the way he sat with such stillness. Maybe it was the calm in his voice. Or maybe, if she was honest with herself, it was just the name on the garment bag. Police chief. She didn't understand why that bothered her, but it did. From the other side of the galley, another flight attendant stepped in. Her name was Mina. She was younger, still new to the airline, and had been quietly watching the whole thing. Was there a problem with the man in 1C? Mina asked softly. Eliza shrugged, pouring herself a quick glass of water. Probably a mix-up, those things happen. He showed you his ticket, didn't he? Yes, Eliza said quickly. But that doesn't always mean it's valid. I've seen it before. People get upgrades through someone they know at the counter. It's not uncommon. Mina didn't respond. She had seen his boarding pass too from a distance, and there was nothing unusual about it. But she knew better than to argue. Eliza wasn't the kind of person who liked being questioned. Back in the cabin, Azim closed his eyes for a moment. He wasn't tired, but he needed to breathe. Not because of Eliza's words, but because of what they meant. This wasn't the first time someone questioned if he belonged. It happened in restaurants, hotel lobbies, even board meetings until someone found out his title. But on planes, it felt worse. Here, in a metal box in the sky, there was no place to walk away, no door to close. Just rows of seats and the judgment that came with them. A few rows back, a young man named Bilal, dressed in a navy sweater and jeans, whispered to his sister Huda, "That guy in 1C, did you see how she treated him?" Huda nodded. "Yeah, that was hard to watch. He didn't even say anything rude." Bilal looked down the aisle again. She didn't question anyone else. Just then, Mina stepped out from the galley and began the safety walkthrough. She passed by Azim's row and gave him a soft nod. He nodded back. She hesitated for half a second, then moved on. Eliza watched from the galley doorway, arms crossed, eyes still fixed on Azim. She didn't like being second-guessed, and now she felt eyes on her too, from passengers, from Mina, and worst of all, from herself. The plane rolled onto the runway, engines roared, and in seconds they were climbing into the sky. Far below, in a quiet office with tall glass windows, Zareen stared at her phone screen. She reread Azim's message, lips pressed into a thin line. Already being questioned. Same story. Don't worry, I'm fine. She wasn't fine either. But unlike Eliza, she knew exactly who she was, and Eliza was about to find out. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime as the plane leveled in the sky. Passengers began adjusting their seats, flipping open magazines or reaching for their drinks. In first class, Azim sat still, watching the clouds drift by through the window. His hands were folded neatly, but his mind wasn't quiet anymore. He could feel the way people looked at him, not with open hate, but with that silent discomfort that followed him in places where he was unexpected. Eliza walked down the aisle with a tray, offering drinks to the first-class passengers. She moved with her usual sharpness, her smile mechanical. When she reached Azim, she paused for a second too long. "Can I offer you something to drink, sir?" she asked, her tone flat. He looked at her. "You didn't offer me anything earlier. Was that also a mistake?" Eliza froze just for a moment. "I must have overlooked it. I was handling some seating matters." "I noticed," he said simply. She cleared her throat and glanced away. "We have juice, water, sparkling water, tea, or coffee." "Just water," Azim said quietly. She poured it and placed the glass in front of him without making eye contact. Then she moved on. In the galley, Mina stood waiting, her arms crossed loosely. When Eliza returned, Mina asked in a careful voice, "Do you think you maybe overreacted with the man in 1C?" Eliza set down the tray a little harder than needed. "I followed protocol." Mina raised an eyebrow. "Did you check the system?" "What?" "His boarding pass. Did you scan it and check the manifest? You just asked him questions." Eliza didn't answer right away. Her face tightened. "I didn't need to. I've been doing this job for 12 years. I can tell when someone's not where they're supposed to be." Mina blinked. "Or maybe you just thought he wasn't." Eliza narrowed her eyes. I don't need advice from someone who's been here for 5 months. Mina didn't argue. She just stepped back and returned to her duties. But something in her chest felt tight. She had watched that exchange earlier, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Eliza had done something wrong. Back in seat 1C, Azim took a small sip of water, then looked at his phone again. Another message had come in, Zareen. What exactly happened? Tell me everything. He typed slowly, his fingers steady. She asked me if I was escorting someone. Acted like I didn't belong. Loud enough for others to hear. I showed her my boarding pass, still didn't believe it. A few seconds passed. Then the reply came. Zareen. What's the flight number? Azim's eyes didn't move from the screen. He knew that tone. Even through text, he could hear her voice clearly. Calm, director, focused. He replied with the flight number and set the phone down again. The clouds outside shifted. So did the air inside the cabin. Azim could feel something building. But it wasn't anger. It was control. Quiet, steady control. Zareen wasn't going to let this go. And Eliza? She had just opened a door she couldn't close. Zareen stood from her desk, her phone still in her hand, eyes locked on the screen. The sunlight through her office window felt harsh now. On the shelf behind her, awards and framed articles displayed her success. CEO of the same airline her husband was now sitting on, being questioned like a stranger. Her name was known throughout the industry. She had rebuilt the company from the ground up after taking over 6 years ago. But none of that mattered if the people working under her couldn't recognize dignity when it sat right in front of them. She walked over to her assistant, Noman, who looked up as soon as she entered his office. I need to speak with operations, she said, her tone leaving no room for delay. Yes, ma'am. Something wrong? Flight 267, first class cabin, there's been an incident, she said, her voice sharper now. Get me a direct line to the captain, and connect the onboard supervisor to the control office, immediately. Noman didn't ask anything further. He picked up the phone and got to work. Back on the plane, Eliza moved through the cabin again, her motions stiff. She avoided looking at Azim, but she felt his presence with every step she took. Something about the way he had spoken earlier unsettled her. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't argued. But somehow, he had made her feel exposed, and she didn't like that. Passengers who had noticed the earlier interaction kept stealing glances at Azim, some with sympathy, some with quiet guilt. But no one said a word. One man in seat 1A, a regular first-class flyer named Tariq, leaned toward Azim and whispered, I saw what happened earlier. That was uncalled for. Azim looked at him, offered a small nod, but said nothing. He had long learned that people saying sorry after the fact didn't undo the silence they kept in the moment. At the front of the plane, the captain received a flashing message on his cockpit screen. It was coded, but he recognized the tag instantly. Executive override. Only one person in the company had that authority. He picked up the internal line. This is Captain Nasir. A calm voice on the other end replied, Captain, this is Control. You have a situation in the first-class cabin involving a passenger. That passenger is Azim Khan. He is the police chief of Chicago Metro. Captain Nasir stiffened. Understood. Control continued. More importantly, he is the husband of our CEO, Zareen Khan. She has given direct instructions. Flight attendant Eliza will report to the cockpit, now. The call ended. Nasir didn't hesitate. He pressed the announcement button and spoke over the intercom. Eliza, please report to the cockpit immediately. Eliza froze mid-step. The passengers looked up, some curious, some surprised. Mina's eyes widened. She had only heard of cockpit calls like this during emergencies or investigations. Eliza handed the tray to another attendant and made her way to the front, her steps suddenly heavier. Azim watched her pass. He didn't move, didn't react, but inside something told him that Zareen had just stepped in. And this flight, it was about to change altitude. For everyone. Eliza stepped into the cockpit with a nervous smile, trying to keep her voice light. Captain, You wanted to see me? Captain Nasir didn't return the smile. He looked serious, his hands resting still on the controls. The first officer glanced at her once, then focused straight ahead. The small screen beside the captain lit up again. A live video call had been established from ground operations. On it appeared the face of Jamal, the head of flight services, sitting stiffly in his office chair. His jaw was tight, his eyes unreadable. "Eliza," he said in a firm voice, "we've received a call from the executive office. There's been a complaint from a first-class passenger, Mr. Azim Khan." Her expression twitched. "Yes, I had to confirm his seat. It seemed—" Jamal cut her off. "Did you scan his boarding pass?" Eliza hesitated. "Well, no, but I checked it." "Did you cross-check it with the manifest before questioning him in front of others?" "No, but—" "Then you made a judgment without following procedure," he said, sharper now. She shifted her weight, suddenly feeling small inside the tight space. "I didn't know who he was." "You didn't need to," Jamal replied. "But since you mentioned it, do you know now?" Eliza blinked. "He said he was a police chief." "He is, but more importantly, he's the husband of Zareen Khan, our CEO." The words hit like a gust of cold wind. Captain Nasir added quietly, "The order is clear. You are to return to Mr. Khan immediately, apologize to him in front of the cabin, and escort him back with full service for the remainder of the flight." Eliza's face turned pale. "In front of everyone?" "Yes," Jamal said flatly. "And once the plane lands, you'll report to the operations office. A formal review will begin immediately." For the first time in years, Eliza had nothing to say. Her voice caught in her throat. She gave a slow nod, unable to hide the stiffness in her body. The captain ended the call and turned back to his instruments. "Fix it, Eliza, and do it properly." She stepped out of the cockpit, her heart thudding so loud she could barely hear the engine's hum. The passengers seemed quieter now. Some had caught parts of the announcement. Others sensed something had shifted. She felt their eyes as she walked down the aisle. Azim looked up as she approached. He didn't smile. He didn't blink, just waited. Eliza crouched slightly beside his seat, forcing her voice to sound polite. "Mr. Khan, there's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to personally apologize and escort you back to your seat." He stared at her for a long moment. "A misunderstanding?" he said calmly. "You questioned me, dismissed my boarding pass, and embarrassed me in front of the cabin, all without checking your system. What part of that was unclear?" Eliza's throat tightened. "You're right, I made a mistake. I apologize." Azim glanced around. Other passengers had gone quiet again, watching, listening. "You didn't question anyone else," he said. "I know," she whispered. "I misjudged you." He paused, then slowly picked up his bag from under the seat. "Let's go then." As he stood, the aisle seemed smaller. The walk back to first class felt longer than before. Passengers parted as he passed. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others nodded slightly as if trying to show support now that it felt safe. But Azim didn't look at them. He just walked. And Eliza. She followed behind him, her hands trembling. The control she once had was gone, and she had no idea how far this was going to reach. Azim returned to seat 1C with quiet steadiness, his face calm but unreadable. He placed his bag back under the seat and adjusted his jacket before sitting down. He didn't speak a word as Eliza hovered nearby, unsure of what to say next. Her usual confidence had vanished. The polished smile she wore during boarding had slipped, replaced now by a stiff expression and eyes that darted from passenger to passenger, trying to avoid the weight of their stares. He looked up at her, his voice still low but firm. "If you're going to apologize, do it the right way." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. She swallowed once before speaking, her voice thin and dry. "Mr. Khan, I apologize for the way I treated you earlier. I made an assumption based on limited information, and it was wrong. I was disrespectful and I embarrassed you publicly. I regret that." It wasn't loud, but it was clear, loud enough for the front rows to hear. A woman in 1D turned her head. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper. The mood in the cabin had shifted completely now, and Eliza felt it pressing in on her from all sides. Azim didn't respond immediately. He sat back, picked up a magazine from the seat pocket in front of him, and flipped it open without even glancing at her. Eliza stood there awkwardly, waiting, hoping for some kind of acknowledgement. But it didn't come. Instead, after a long silence, he said quietly, "I've faced worse. But that doesn't make this acceptable." She nodded slowly, then turned to leave, but his voice stopped her again. "Before you go," he said, still not looking at her, "tell me, why did you question me and no one else in this cabin?" Eliza turned back around, her mouth parting slightly. I don't know." "You do know," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "You just don't want to say it." She looked down. "I misjudged you," she repeated, but it was softer this time. Less of a line, more of a truth. He gave a slight nod, then looked out the window again. Then learned from it. She stood there for another second before walking away, her shoes clicking softly against the floor. She didn't return to the galley right away. Instead, she went into the lavatory, locked the door behind her, and leaned against the mirror, her hands trembling. Her chest felt tight, not just from embarrassment, but from something heavier. She knew passengers were still watching her. She could feel it. The whispering hadn't stopped, and Mina's expression earlier, quiet but pointed, was burned into her mind. In the galley, Mina continued the service on her own, her movements smooth but silent. She didn't speak to Eliza when she eventually returned. She didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already played out in the aisle. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Azim sat with his hands resting on the armrests. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way people expected. He had been dealing with this kind of thing all his life, being questioned, being stared at, being second-guessed. He had just never expected it to happen here, not when he was flying under the airline his wife had spent years building with her own hands. His phone vibrated again. It was a message from Zareen. "She apologized yet?" He replied, "Yes, in front of everyone." "Good. Stay seated. Let me handle the rest." Azim slid the phone back into his jacket. Whatever was coming next, he knew Zareen would make sure it was handled. Not because he was her husband, but because this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't belong, even when they did. Eliza kept herself busy with small tasks, wiping tray tables that were already clean, straightening napkins that hadn't moved, organizing things that didn't need organizing. She avoided looking at the first-class cabin. Every time she passed by Azim's row, her steps slowed slightly, but she never stopped. There was an invisible line between her and him now, and she could feel it burning through the aisle. The atmosphere had changed. It wasn't loud, but it was heavy. A silence hung in the air, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that made people clear their throats unnecessarily or pretend to scroll through their phones. Some passengers occasionally glanced at Azim, then quickly turned away, as if afraid he might notice. Others stared longer, quietly watching, knowing they had witnessed something they didn't have the courage to stop when it happened. In 1A, Tariq leaned toward the man beside him and whispered, "Did you see how she walked back from the cockpit? I think she got called out." The man nodded. She should have been. That was shameful. Back in the galley, Mina carefully poured a glass of sparkling water and placed it on a tray. Without a word, she made her way to Azim's seat and gently placed the glass on his table. "Sir," she said softly, "sparkling water. On the house." He glanced up, giving her a faint nod. "Thank you, Mina." She blinked in surprise that he knew her name, then smiled faintly. "Let me know if you need anything else." As she turned to walk away, he added, "You were the only one who looked uncomfortable when it happened." She paused. "Because it was wrong." He nodded again, this time with a little more weight. "You're young. You'll go far if you keep noticing what others try to ignore." She didn't know how to respond. so she just gave a respectful nod and continued down the aisle. Azim took a sip of the sparkling water, the bubbles sharp on his tongue. He wasn't thirsty, but he wanted something to do. His thoughts were starting to spiral, not with anger, but with memory. He remembered the time a hotel manager asked him to wait in the lobby while other guests were helped. He remembered a department head who once told him, "You speak very well for someone from your background." He remembered how, every time he earned something, someone tried to subtract it from him, question it, doubt it, challenge it. Not directly, but always in little ways that chipped away at dignity. But today was different. Today there were witnesses. Today there was consequence. At that moment, the captain's voice came through the speaker, smooth and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to inform you that we're cruising at 36,000 feet. We'll begin our descent in about 45 minutes. Please feel free to sit back and enjoy the rest of the flight." Eliza, standing at the galley counter, gripped the edge with both hands. Her breath was shaky. The call from the cockpit had been bad enough, but it wasn't over, not even close. She hadn't forgotten the last words from Jamal over the cockpit line. "You'll report to operations when the plane lands, and you'll face the executive board." She wasn't sure what they would say, but she had a feeling it wouldn't be a soft warning or a quiet conversation. She had humiliated someone with power, and she had done it based on a quick glance, a snap judgment, and a bias she had never admitted until now. Behind her, Mina stepped into the galley again, wiping her hands. Eliza spoke suddenly. "You think I'm finished, don't you?" Mina didn't answer right away. She leaned against the panel beside the coffee machine, looking tired. "I think," she said finally, "that you're lucky he didn't say more. Most people wouldn't have handled it like he did." Eliza turned to face her, voice sharper. "You think I'm racist?" Mina raised her eyebrows. "I think you saw a black man sitting in first class, and you didn't ask yourself anything else." Eliza's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. She couldn't. The silence that followed stretched for a few seconds before Mina quietly added, "You should start thinking about what you're going to say when you land. Because I don't think this will go away with a half apology." Eliza didn't reply. She couldn't. She reached for a paper towel, wiped her already clean hands, and walked out of the galley. In seat 1C, Azim looked at his phone again. Another message had come in from Zareen. "We'll be waiting at the gate. Don't leave your seat when we land. Let them come to you." He smiled faintly, not because he was enjoying this, but because he trusted her. She had built her name in rooms where no one gave her permission. She had built a company where people like her husband could fly in peace. And now, someone had broken that peace. Zareen wasn't the type to let that pass. The quiet inside the plane had taken on a different weight now, thick, uncomfortable, and stretched out like time itself was moving slower. Most of the passengers had stopped pretending they weren't paying attention. Even those deep into their screens or books would occasionally glance toward the front, toward Azim, toward the galley where Eliza had gone quiet. Every now and then, a whisper broke through the hush, small and sharp. "She really did that to him? Do you think she'll be fired?" He didn't even raise his voice. Azim heard them. He wasn't trying to. But he'd been in enough rooms, walked through enough doorways, to know when a crowd was shifting its weight from curiosity to guilt. He sat comfortably in his seat, but his back was straight and his hands folded. He had finished his water, yet he hadn't asked for anything else. He didn't need a drink or a meal. What he needed was already in motion, and he could feel it, steadily approaching like the runway ahead. A man across the aisle leaned slightly toward him. His name was Naveed, mid-50s, expensive suit, a regular business traveler. He gave Azim a tight, uncomfortable smile. "Sir, if you don't mind me saying, I saw what happened earlier. That was unfortunate." Azim turned toward him, eyebrows raised. "Unfortunate." Naveed cleared his throat. "Yes, well, clearly a mistake on her part." Azim studied him for a moment, then asked calmly, "Did you think it was a mistake when she questioned me, or only after you realized who I was?" Naveed opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out. His fingers tapped the edge of his seat, his smile fading fast. "That's what I thought," Azim said, turning back to the window. Naveed sat back in his seat, face turning slightly red. A few rows behind, a young woman named Fariha, who had been silent the entire flight, typed something quickly into her phone. She posted a short update to her social media. On this flight, a man got humiliated by a flight attendant for sitting in first class. Turns out he's the police chief, and his wife owns the airline. Whole plane is silent now. The post started gaining traction almost instantly. In the cockpit, Captain Nasir received another direct message from ground control. CEO arrival confirmed. Vehicle standing by at gate. Security escort authorized. Prepare passenger Azim Khan for direct disembark. He sighed, adjusted his headset, and relayed the information to the crew. "Eliza," his voice came through her earpiece. "The CEO will be meeting the flight upon arrival. You are to remain on board after all passengers have disembarked. Security will escort you directly to operations." Eliza was standing by the beverage cart, frozen. Her hands had stopped moving. Mina looked over, her eyes narrowing. She had heard enough to understand what was coming. Eliza turned slowly. Her voice cracked when she asked, "She's really coming here?" "Yes," the captain replied, and she asked that Mr. Khan remain seated after landing. Eliza's throat felt tight. "Is she going to speak to me?" There was a pause. Then, "I don't know. But she'll definitely speak to someone." Eliza didn't respond. She stood there for a few seconds before slowly making her way toward the front of the cabin. She walked past Azim without saying a word. He didn't look at her. Her footsteps felt heavy, like each one sank deeper into the floor. In the row behind Azim, Bilal leaned toward his sister Huda and whispered, "She's finished, isn't she?" Huda didn't look up from her phone. "She should be." Bilal nodded. "But she won't apologize properly. People like her never do." At that moment, Azim's phone buzzed once more. "Zareen. Plane lands in 20 minutes. Don't speak to anyone else. I'll handle it from here." He smiled faintly. There was no anger in him now, only stillness, confidence, because he knew that this time it wouldn't be brushed aside. Not in a report, not in a quiet HR meeting. This time, the silence had witnesses. The whispers had turned into attention. And the woman who had been humiliated? She wasn't on this flight. But she owned every inch of it, and she was almost there. The plane began its slow descent, and the seatbelt sign lit up with a soft chime. Passengers shifted in their seats, fastening belts, closing tray tables, and straightening their posture. But the usual pre-landing chatter wasn't there. The air inside the cabin felt tight, like the whole flight was holding its breath. Azim sat silently in 1C, his body still, his mind steady. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't even angry anymore. He had lived through enough to know that dignity didn't need to shout to be heard. It just needed to be protected. And today, he wasn't the one doing the protecting. Zareen was. And when she decided to move, she never did it halfway. He looked down at his phone. One more message from her had come through. "Security will meet the aircraft. Do not speak until I arrive. Watch their faces." A slight smile touched his lips. He slipped the phone into his coat pocket and stared ahead. The clouds were breaking now, and city lights began to shimmer beneath them. Everything that had been quietly brewing up in the sky was about to land on solid ground, and it was going to hit harder than any turbulence. In the galley, Eliza gripped the back counter, her hands clammy. Her eyes darted toward the aisle, toward Azim's row, then back down again. Her thoughts were spinning in circles. What had started as a casual check, a routine assumption, had turned into a nightmare. She kept trying to convince herself she hadn't meant it like that she was just doing her job. But the truth had been made plain by too many eyes. She hadn't questioned anyone else, only him. And not because of rules, because of what she thought she saw. Mina moved beside her, checking the landing prep items without a word. The silence between them was different now, not from tension, but from clarity. Mina didn't have to say anything. Eliza already knew where she stood. "Are they really coming?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mina nodded once. "She's already at the gate." Eliza closed her eyes for a second. She had never met Zareen Khan in person, only seen her on magazine covers, in press videos, and framed photos in the training center. She was one of those rare leaders people actually listened to, not because she shouted, but because when she made a decision, no one could undo it. In the cockpit, Captain Nasir finished his landing briefing and tapped into the cabin announcement system. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago. Local time is 6:42 p.m. Please remain seated until the aircraft reaches the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. For some passengers, security will assist with deplaning." The last sentence wasn't standard. It turned heads. A woman in seat 2D blinked. "Did he just say security?" Huda whispered to Bilal. "They're not wasting time." As the wheels touched down and the plane slowed on the runway, Azim felt the shift, not just in the plane's motion, but in the way people looked at him now. Those who had ignored him at the start of the flight now watched him with a mix of discomfort and curiosity. The man in the expensive suit, Naveed, had grown quiet. Even he seemed unsure how to carry himself now that the mask had fallen. Azim adjusted his cuff, sat back in his seat, and closed his eyes for a brief moment. Outside, the aircraft pulled up to a private gate. A black SUV with tinted windows stood waiting. Two security officers in dark uniforms stood by the jet bridge, their expressions firm, posture alert. Behind them, a woman in a tailored navy coat stood calmly with her arms crossed. Her scarf blew slightly in the wind, but her stance was rooted, solid. Zareen. She didn't speak. She didn't rush. She simply waited as the gate was secured and the door unlocked from inside. Eliza stood frozen near the front galley, her body tense, lips pressed tightly together. She could hear the murmurs growing louder now, passengers sitting up straighter, glancing toward the door, wondering what was going to happen next. The seatbelt sign turned off with a chime. Normally this would be the cue for chaos, people jumping up, grabbing bags, jostling for the aisle, but no one moved. The entire first-class cabin sat still. Captain Nasir stepped out of the cockpit and walked directly to Azim's seat. "Mr. Khan," he said with respectful firmness, "please remain seated. Security will escort you momentarily." Azim gave a simple nod. "Understood." Then came the moment. The door opened, and Zareen stepped onto the plane. She didn't smile. She didn't raise her voice. She just stood there, taking in the scene with sharp eyes. Her gaze swept across the faces in first class. She spotted Azim instantly and gave a subtle nod. Then her eyes landed on Eliza, and they didn't move. Eliza's throat tightened. Everything that had happened 35,000 feet in the air had just landed, and Zareen was about to bring the rest of the weight down. Zareen stood in the aircraft doorway, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Her presence alone seemed to quiet the hum of the engines. The passengers nearest the front leaned subtly to the side, trying to catch her face, their curiosity now turning into awe. This wasn't just the CEO of the airline. This was the woman everyone had been hearing about during the flight. The one whose husband had been humiliated just hours earlier. Eliza stood rooted to the floor, unable to speak. Her mouth had gone dry, and her mind was scrambling for anything, an excuse, an explanation, a reason. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. Zareen's eyes didn't blink as they locked onto her. They were steady, not angry, but sharp enough to slice through everything Eliza had rehearsed in her head. Zareen walked slowly into the cabin, each step deliberate, calm, almost quiet, but every footstep felt louder than the next. She didn't stop until she was standing directly in front of Azim's seat. He looked up at her with a faint smile that held no gloating, only familiarity. "You okay?" she asked gently, the first softness she had shown since stepping on board. He nodded once. "I'm fine." She nodded back. Then she turned to face the cabin, her voice rising just enough to be heard clearly. "My name is Zareen Khan. I am the CEO of this airline. A few hours ago, my husband, Police Chief Azim Khan, was publicly questioned by a senior crew member in front of you all. Not because his ticket was incorrect, not because of any mistake, but because someone looked at him and decided he didn't belong. The cabin was silent. "Let me be clear," she continued, her tone now firmer. "This airline has rules, procedures, training. We don't teach judgment based on appearance. And we don't tolerate it when it happens." She turned toward Eliza, whose face had drained of color. "You embarrassed a decorated officer, a man who has spent decades protecting people, including people like you. And you didn't even bother to check the system before humiliating him in front of an entire flight." Eliza tried to speak. "Ma'am, Zareen raised a hand, not to silence her, but to stop her from embarrassing herself further. "Save it for the board." The air felt tight again, tighter than it had been all flight. The quiet inside the cabin wasn't just silence, it was realization. Passengers were now confronting their own inaction. The whispers, the side glances, the decision to stay quiet when someone was being questioned without reason. Now that the full truth had unfolded, many couldn't look at Azim directly. Zareen stepped aside as two uniformed security officers entered the aircraft. They approached Eliza without a word, one standing beside her, the other just behind. "You'll come with us," one of them said. Eliza nodded faintly, her body stiff. She looked at Zareen once, hoping for some sort of softness, some kind of last-minute leniency. But Zareen's face didn't change. Not cold, just resolved, like a judge who had already heard enough. As Eliza was escorted off the plane, some passengers watched with guilt, others with quiet satisfaction. A few turned away, unsure of how to process what they had just witnessed. The woman who had strutted through the cabin hours earlier now looked like a ghost of herself, her steps small, her shoulders hunched, her eyes fixed on the floor. Zareen turned back to Azim, lowering her voice again. "They've scheduled a full review. She's suspended effective immediately." Azim nodded. "That's fair." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You handled it with more control than I ever could have." He smiled softly. "It wasn't the first time." She sighed. "And that's the problem." Mina approached quietly, standing at a respectful distance. Zareen noticed her, then gave her a single nod. "You're the only crew member who acted with any sense." Mina swallowed, caught off guard. "I just did what I thought was right. And that's exactly why I want to speak with you after we disembark," Zareen said. "Not to question you, but to thank you." Mina's eyes widened, and she gave a slight bow of her head. Zareen looked back at Azim. "There's a car waiting outside. Let's go." He stood up, adjusting his coat, glancing once more down the aisle. The same aisle where he had once walked alone, under quiet judgment, now felt different. This time, when he passed the rows of seats, people didn't avoid his eyes. They held them, not out of challenge, but out of respect. And none of them would forget what happened on that flight. Neither would he. But more importantly, neither would the woman who ran the skies. Azim and Zareen stepped off the plane into the private gate corridor, escorted by security, and followed closely by Mina, who had been asked to accompany them. As the heavy door behind them sealed shut, it felt like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. The whispers, the stares, the weight of silent guilt were all left behind on the aircraft. But for those who had witnessed the humiliation and said nothing, the memory would linger. Outside on the tarmac, the cool evening air brushed against Azim's face. Waiting at the foot of the stairs was a sleek black car, doors open, driver standing ready. No press, no flashing cameras, just quiet precision. Zareen had made sure this wasn't going to be a public performance. She wasn't interested in attention. She was interested in consequences. As they walked toward the vehicle, Zareen turned slightly toward Mina. "When we're back at headquarters, I want your full report, from the beginning. Everything you saw, what was said, how you responded." Mina nodded quickly. "Of course, ma'am." Zareen gave a faint nod. "You weren't in charge today, but you showed more leadership than the one who was." Mina didn't know how to respond. Praise from a woman like Zareen didn't come lightly, and it wasn't handed out for free. It was earned. And today, Mina had earned it. As Azim entered the car, Zareen remained standing by the door for a moment. Her eyes lifted toward the aircraft behind them, where Eliza was still inside, now being interviewed by two senior operations managers in one of the empty rows near the back. She had been told to remain on the plane until she was cleared for departure, but Zareen had already made her decision. The process would be formal, yes, but the outcome was clear. She climbed into the back seat beside Azim and closed the door. The interior of the car was warm, quiet, and dimly lit, a stark contrast to the harsh tension of the flight. Zareen turned to him. "She'll never wear that uniform again." Azim leaned his head back against the seat, finally letting out a breath he'd been holding since takeoff. Good. There was a long silence between them. Not uncomfortable, just quiet. A silence between two people who didn't need to fill the air with words. Everything they had to say had already been said with looks, decisions, and silence. "She was confident," Zareen said finally. "Confident enough to humiliate you, in front of everyone, and still believed she was right." "She wasn't just confident," Azim replied. "She was sure no one would stop her." Zareen nodded slowly. "That's what I can't allow. Not in my company, not in my name." Azim glanced over at her. "You changed a lot when you took over." "I didn't change enough," she said firmly. "There are still too many people in positions of authority who act without consequence, and too many who watch and say nothing." She reached into her bag and pulled out a tablet. With a few quick taps, she opened a file marked "Immediate Action, Crew Behavior Reform." "I'm calling for a board meeting tomorrow. Full revision of first-class service policy. Mandatory bias training for all in-flight staff. Anonymous reporting for passengers and crew. And starting next week, I'm handpicking 5 crew leads for a new internal review council." Azim looked at her. "You're going to do all that because of this?" Zareen turned her head toward him. "Not just because of this. Because this was seen. Most of the time, people like you are humiliated quietly when no one is watching. This time, people watched, and no one said a thing. That's what I'm going to change." Azim nodded, eyes distant. "It's not about her, is it?" "No," Zareen said. "It never was." The car rolled through the private exit gate, leaving the airport behind. Back inside, Eliza sat stiffly in the same seat, still flanked by 2 members of the Internal Review Board. Her eyes were red, her voice quieter now. She had stopped arguing, stopped justifying. Her answers were short, measured, broken. One of the managers closed the file in front of him and stood. "We'll be in touch within 24 hours. For now, your clearance has been suspended. You are not permitted to wear your uniform or enter any aircraft until further notice." Eliza didn't respond. They left her there in silence. And in that silence, she finally understood something. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been a choice. One she had made without thinking. And now, one she would carry for the rest of her life. Outside, Zareen and Azim's car disappeared into the city lights. The sky overhead, where power had once tried to hide behind a smile, now carried the echoes of accountability. And for the first time in years, Azim felt something he rarely felt anymore: peace. The city skyline rolled past the windows of the black car as it moved smoothly through traffic. Inside, the warmth of the leather seats offered comfort, but Azim wasn't resting. His body was relaxed, yes, but his mind was alert. He had replayed the events of the flight enough times already. The tone Eliza had used, the way her eyes dismissed him, the silence from the passengers, the slow, creeping humiliation that had begun with a single sentence. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" He had learned long ago how to keep his calm, how to hold back the sharp edge of anger and replace it with patience, composure, control. But even the strongest self-restraint couldn't erase the sting of being treated like a trespasser in a place you rightfully belonged. Zareen, seated beside him, was working quietly on her tablet. Her fingers moved fast, eyes locked on the screen. her face composed but serious. This wasn't reactionary anger. This was policy in motion. Action with intent. Her leadership had never been about noise. It had always been about follow-through. And now she was building something Eliza would never see, but something others would benefit from for years. "You're already drafting new policy?" Azim asked quietly, glancing over. "Already done," Zareen replied. "It goes into implementation by Friday. Every crew member, every route. No more surface-level training, no more empty apologies." Azim watched her fingers pause above the screen. She looked at him, her eyes softening just a little. "I'm not just doing this because you're my husband. I'm doing this because if it can happen to you, someone with a title, with experience, with calm, it can happen to anyone. And not everyone has someone waiting at the gate." He nodded slowly. "They rarely do." The car turned into the underground garage of their building. Security was waiting. The vehicle came to a gentle stop, and the door was opened for them. Azim stepped out first, stretching his back slightly. Zareen followed, still holding her tablet and her composure. They rode the elevator in silence. The doors opened into their apartment. Minimalist, calm, elegant. The city stretched far below through floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Lights blinked in the distance. Cars like moving dots. Life going on, unaware of the storm that had passed quietly above them just hours ago. Azim placed his coat on the rack and walked to the kitchen. He poured a glass of water, took a slow sip, then leaned against the counter. "I wonder if she'll ever really understand what she did," he said. Zareen stepped beside him. "Maybe not today, but she'll remember how it felt when she was walked off that plane. That moment, it won't leave her." Azim nodded. "It's a start, but it's not enough." "No," Zareen agreed. "It's not." There was a pause. The air between them was thick with shared experience. Not just today's, but the years before it. The unspoken glances, the assumptions, the rooms where they were treated like the help, even when they were running the show. "I didn't expect that today," Azim said finally. "Neither did I," Zareen replied. "But sometimes these things come when they think you're not ready, and that's their mistake." He looked at her. "You were ready." "I always am," she said, almost without emotion. She turned and walked toward her study. As she stepped in, her phone buzzed again, an internal alert. A media leak. Someone had posted about the flight on social media. The story was spreading fast. Passengers were confirming details. Screenshots were surfacing. A name had not yet been released, but the story had gone viral within the hour. Zareen stared at the screen for a moment, then locked her phone. She didn't need to fan the flames. She didn't need the world to scream in outrage. Her responsibility wasn't to social media. It was to policy, to truth, to structure, and to every person who might one day sit in seat 1C, only to be told they didn't belong. She sat at her desk, opened her notes, and began finalizing her address to the executive board. Tomorrow wouldn't be about Eliza. It would be about culture, accountability, and the invisible rules people carried in their heads. She didn't want punishment. She wanted change. Back in the kitchen, Azim looked out the window, the city lights still glowing, quiet and steady. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply stood there, at peace. Not because justice had been served in full, but because for once, someone like Eliza hadn't walked away untouched. For once, someone else had to sit in the discomfort, and he, finally, had been seen. The next morning arrived quietly, without drama or headlines. The sky over Chicago was pale and cold, the kind that made the city feel slow and thoughtful. But inside the headquarters of the airline, nothing was quiet. Zareen arrived early, dressed in a charcoal gray coat, crisp blouse beneath, hair pulled back with sharp elegance. Her team was already in place. Department heads, board members, HR executives, all seated around the long glass table in the executive boardroom. No one spoke as she entered. They had all received the internal report. They had all seen the names. And they all knew this meeting wasn't just about one flight or one employee. It was about what their company had silently allowed to grow under the surface. She placed her leather folder on the table, opened it slowly, and began without small talk. "This isn't a meeting," she said. "It's a correction." Everyone sat a little straighter. What happened yesterday wasn't just a personal insult to a single man. It was a display of unchecked power, a reflection of what happens when training becomes a box to tick and not a standard to uphold. We sell our service with words like excellence, dignity, and respect. But none of that means anything if the people we trust with our brand use their authority to humiliate passengers they simply don't expect to see in a first-class seat. No one interrupted. No one dared. "I've launched a formal investigation, and yes, the staff member in question has been suspended. But this doesn't stop with her. We will be reviewing every complaint from the last 18 months, every small misunderstanding, every guest conflict that was quietly marked as resolved. Because buried in those reports are the names of people who were treated like they didn't belong. And most of them didn't have a wife in a boardroom waiting to respond." One of the senior board members, a man named Irfan, cleared his throat gently. "With respect, Zareen, what happened was unacceptable. But this incident is already spreading online. Should we prepare a statement before it escalates?" Zareen didn't look up from her folder. "No." The room froze. "We're not chasing headlines," she said. "We're fixing what caused them. The moment we release a PR statement, this becomes a press issue. It's not. It's a values issue, and we will deal with it internally first, with real reform, not a carefully worded apology to keep our brand safe." She closed the folder and finally looked up. "Here's what's happening. All crew leaders will undergo immediate retraining, not by consultants, by people who understand the experience of being watched, doubted, and judged. People who've lived it, not just studied it," she continued, her tone razor sharp. "We're also introducing a protocol for on-flight conflict that allows any staff member, not just senior crew, to raise silent alerts to management if they witness discrimination. And those alerts will go directly to my office." Several board members exchanged glances. "And," Zareen added, her voice calm but firm, "starting today, any flight attendant with more than 3 flagged interactions, resolved or not, will face immediate review, because patterns don't lie, and this company will no longer pretend they're not there." The room went silent again, not from disagreement but from the slow, dawning realization that something permanent had just been set in motion. Zareen leaned back in her chair, her expression unchanged. "We've built a successful brand. Now we need to build an honorable one. This company doesn't just belong to shareholders or VIPs. It belongs to every person who boards a flight expecting to be treated like a human being." Irfan nodded slowly, murmuring, "Understood." "Good," Zareen said. "Then let's begin." As the boardroom slowly filled with quiet discussion and shuffling papers, Zareen's eyes remained still. She wasn't thinking about Eliza anymore. She wasn't even thinking about Azim. She was thinking about the hundreds of passengers who had probably walked off planes over the years feeling small, unseen, or disrespected, because someone in uniform decided they didn't belong. Those people never got a meeting. But today, they had one. Meanwhile, across the city, Azim stood in front of a classroom full of young recruits at the police academy. He had been scheduled to speak weeks earlier, long before the flight. The topic: leadership under pressure. He didn't mention the plane, he didn't mention Eliza, but when he spoke about the importance of staying calm when someone questions your worth, the room went completely still. And in that moment, he wasn't just a police chief. He was proof that dignity didn't have to raise its voice to be heard. It only had to stand its ground. By late afternoon, word had quietly spread across the airline's internal networks. Every crew member, from senior flight leads to gate agents, had received a formal message. Mandatory policy review sessions scheduled, attendance required. It didn't take long for people to connect the dots. The tone of the message was different, more direct, less polished. It wasn't a friendly memo, it was a signal. Something had shifted at the top, and this wasn't going to blow over like every other incident that had been smoothed out with silence. In the break rooms at terminals, people whispered. Some defended Eliza, insisting she was just doing her job. Others said nothing, but their silence wasn't agreement. It was recognition. They'd seen things too. Maybe they had looked the other way. Maybe they had done nothing. But now they were thinking twice. In a small briefing room at the training center, Mina sat alone, scrolling through her phone. Her inbox was flooded. Messages from co-workers she hadn't spoken to in months. "You okay? Heard what happened. Respect for how you handled it. You're probably going to get promoted after this." But none of the messages felt comforting. Mina wasn't thinking about rewards or recognition. She was still thinking about the moment she saw Azim sit silently, while a room full of strangers let him be questioned like he had snuck onto the flight. And how easy it would have been for her to look away too. The door opened. Zareen stepped inside alone, closing the door softly behind her. Mina stood up quickly. "Ma'am." Zareen raised a hand gently. "Relax. Sit." Mina nodded and sat back down, her hands folded nervously in her lap. Zareen pulled out a chair across from her, lowered herself slowly, and met her eyes. "I read your statement. I read it twice, actually." Mina swallowed. "I tried to be honest." "You were," Zareen said. "And more than that, you acted in real time. You didn't wait for permission. You saw something wrong and didn't hide behind rank." Mina didn't know what to say, so she just listened. Zareen continued. "Do you know how rare that is in this industry? People follow chain of command. They follow protocol, but they rarely follow principle. That's what stood out to me." Mina's throat felt tight. It just didn't sit right. The way she treated him. He didn't even raise his voice. Zareen nodded slowly. "He never does." For a moment, the room was still. Zareen leaned forward slightly. "You're being reassigned." Mina's eyes widened, and her heart jumped. "Ma'am." "Not fired," Zareen added quickly, lips curling faintly. "Promoted." Mina blinked. "To what?" "To Flight Operations Lead Assistant. You'll be shadowing my office for the next 3 months. I want you to help oversee the new crew reform program." Mina stared at her, unable to speak. "I don't need someone with years of seniority. I need someone who knows what right looks like and what wrong feels like when no one else wants to name it." Mina finally found her voice. "Thank you. I don't know what to say." Zareen smiled gently, the first real warmth in her face all day. "Say yes." "Yes," Mina said quickly, almost breathless. Zareen stood, nodding once more. "Someone like you should be helping decide how people get treated up there. Not just following rules, but writing new ones." She walked to the door but paused just before opening it. "Oh, and Mina?" "Yes?" "You didn't just help my husband. You reminded this company who we're supposed to be." And with that, she left. Mina sat in the empty room for a moment longer, stunned. Her heart pounded, not from fear this time, but from something else. Pride, maybe. Or relief. Maybe both. Meanwhile, across the city, Azim walked out of the academy building, his coat draped over one arm. A few of the young cadets had stopped him at the door, asking quiet questions about his speech. One had said, "Sir, how do you stay calm when people test you like that?" Azim had looked him in the eyes and said, "Because when you know who you are, no one else gets to decide." Now, as he stepped into the crisp evening air, he thought back to the flight. Not the humiliation, but the silence, the looks, the way justice hadn't come in a loud moment, but in 1,000 quiet ones. Zareen's steady steps, Mina's quiet nod, the passengers who turned their heads and those who later dropped them. And as he walked through the parking lot toward his car, his phone buzzed once. A message from Zareen. "She's been let go. It's official." Then another, a moment later. "The Flight Crew Review Council. Your name's on the founding board." He smiled to himself, sliding the phone into his pocket. For once, silence hadn't protected the powerful. For once, the quiet man had the final word. Evening fell over the city like a soft curtain, drawing the day to a close. But for Azim and Zareen, something much bigger was ending. Not just a day, not just a flight, but a pattern, one that had gone unchecked for too long. At home, the lights were dimmed, the air calm. The noise of the outside world, emails, messages, the growing online storm, was shut out by the thick glass windows of their high-rise apartment. In the living room, Azim sat on the edge of the couch, a book resting on his lap but forgotten. His eyes were focused on the quiet skyline outside, where buildings sparkled like fragments of stories that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Zareen entered from her office, tablet in one hand, her scarf wrapped loosely around her shoulders. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood for a moment, watching her husband, letting the silence settle. He turned slightly. "You didn't come to bed last night." She smiled faintly. "Neither did you." He nodded, setting the book down. "Too much on your plate?" "I've had worse," she said, walking over and sitting beside him. But this one felt different. "Because it was," he replied. "It was personal." Zareen stared at the skyline for a moment. "It shouldn't have to be personal for us to care this much. But maybe that's what makes change happen. When the right people finally get tired of being silent." Azim leaned back, stretching his arms slightly. "You handled it like you always do, quietly, without fire, but with precision." She chuckled softly. "You know what's funny? When I first joined this company, they told me to stay behind the curtain, that CEOs shouldn't get involved in day-to-day drama, that I should let middle management handle employee discipline." Azim raised an eyebrow. "You ever listen to that advice?" "Only once," she said. "And I regretted it for a long time. That's why, when your message came through, I didn't hesitate." He turned to look at her fully now. "You didn't just protect me, Zareen. You protected everyone like me. Everyone who's ever been asked, 'Are you sure you belong here?'" Zareen nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one gets to ask that question anymore, not on my planes." For a few minutes, they just sat together. The sounds of the city far below hummed in the distance. In the quiet, the weight of the last 24 hours began to lift. Not all at once, but in slow pieces. Then Azim's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up and stared at the screen. A news article had just been published. "Airline CEO takes swift action after in-flight incident. Employee dismissed. New reform program announced." Beneath the headline, there were photos. One of Zareen in a conference room, mid-speech. Another of Mina standing beside a press board. And a third, taken discreetly by a passenger on the flight, of Azim sitting in seat 1C, quiet, dignified, composed. Zareen leaned over to look. "It's spreading fast." "Do you want it to?" he asked. She shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Let them talk. Let it reach the ones who need to see it." He looked at her, really looked. At the lines in her face, the calm in her eyes, the steady strength she always carried without armor. "You didn't choose this life for attention," he said. "You chose it for impact." "And I got both," she replied, her voice soft but full. Outside, snow had begun to fall, light flakes drifting past the window, catching in the city lights like ash from a fire that had finally burned out. Inside, Azim reached for her hand, held it gently. "What happens next?" Zareen smiled. "We keep going. We rebuild. And we teach everyone in this company, from the gate to the cockpit, exactly what respect looks like." Azim nodded once. "And if someone forgets?" She looked him in the eye. "They'll be reminded." They sat there a little longer, hand in hand, watching the snow. Far away in 1,000 airports, new passengers were boarding new flights. Most of them wouldn't know what had happened yesterday. They'd walk onto planes, take their seats, expect a normal trip. But somewhere in the system, something had changed. Policies were shifting. Eyes were opening. A new voice had entered the rooms that had once been silent. and that voice belonged to people who were no longer willing to be ignored. This wasn't a story about revenge. It wasn't a story about titles or power. It was a story about what happens when dignity meets resistance and doesn't flinch. Azim had been questioned for simply sitting in the right seat. Now the question would belong to everyone else. Who do you think belongs here now? If this story moved you, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more powerful stories like this one.